They said it wasn't personal. But how would you feel if your own mother looked you in the eye and said, "We wish you weren't at your sister's wedding"? I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just picked up my camera and walked away. 3 weeks later, while they posed for photos under the Miami sun, I was standing on a stage a few miles down the coast, holding an award. I never expected. By morning, the clip had gone viral. Calls, messages, headlines. The family that once silenced me couldn't stop hearing my name. I'm Olivia Reed, and this is how being unwanted became my most powerful story. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The kitchen smelled like lilies and champagne that morning. The kind of scent that sticks to the air and makes it hard to breathe. Sunlight spilled through the window, turning the marble counter into a mirror of gold and shadow. My mother was arranging flowers, white roses, lilies, and baby's breath, lining them up like soldiers on parade. My sister Hannah hovered beside her, smiling nervously as Mom adjusted a petal here, a ribbon there. The radio hummed with soft wedding music, the kind that people think sounds elegant, but always makes me feel like I'm waiting for something to break. I stood at the end of the table, trimming stems, trying to stay invisible. "Need help with the seating chart?" I asked, keeping my tone light, polite, unthreatening. Mom didn't look up. "No, sweetie. I think it's better if you just stay out of it." Her voice was smooth, practiced the same tone she used with telemarketers, or waiters who brought the wrong order. Hannah glanced at me quickly, guilt flickering across her face, then looked away. I nodded, pretending to focus on the lilies. The sound of scissors cutting through stems filled the silence. I counted each snip like a heartbeat. 3, 4, 5, before Mom spoke again. "We wish you weren't at your sister's wedding," she said. "You always turn moments into scenes." The air shifted. Even the radio seemed to pause. My father Charles stood at the coffee machine, mid-pour, the dark liquid dripping unevenly into his mug. He froze, eyes darting between us, then looked back down, as if the steam might hide him. I looked at my mother. She didn't look angry. She looked calm. Too calm, like she'd rehearsed the line. "I understand," I said quietly. It wasn't the first time I'd said those words, but somehow they tasted different that morning. Bitter. Final. My dog Cooper trotted into the room, tail wagging, nails clicking against the tile. He circled the table, oblivious to the quiet war happening above him. Hannah broke the silence, her voice small. "Mom, maybe." Margaret raised a hand without looking at her. "Hannah, focus on your bouquet. We're behind schedule." Hannah pressed her lips together and went back to folding the ivory napkins. The radio changed songs. Canon in D. Of course. The wedding anthem for people who wanted their lives to sound perfect. I placed the finished bouquet on the table, wiped my hands on a towel, and said, "I'll head back to Portland tomorrow." Mom didn't even look up. "Do that." I waited for Dad to say something. Anything. But he just stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking against the mug, in a rhythm that filled the space where words should have been. The lilies on the table gleamed under the light. I'd always loved lilies. Strong stems, quiet scent, impossible to ignore if you were close enough. I picked up my coat from the chair and whistled for Cooper. He followed me out to the porch, tail still wagging. The air outside was cool, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that smelled faintly of pine and rain, even in August. From the driveway, I looked back at the house. The house where I'd spent 18 years learning to take up less space. Through the kitchen window, I could see my father standing there watching. Our eyes met for half a second. He gave me a faint, apologetic smile before turning away. I wanted to be angry, but mostly I felt tired. Cooper sniffed around the mailbox while I leaned against my car. The radio inside played another love song, something classical and soft bleeding through the cracked window. I got and started the engine and waited for the air conditioner to kick in. My reflection stared back at me in the rearview mirror, calm face, tight jaw, the kind of expression people mistake for strength. I didn't cry. Not anymore. As I pulled out of the driveway, the song swelled violins rising like a curtain. I thought of Hannah's big day, of my mother's perfect centerpieces, of my father's silence that always passed for peace. The road stretched ahead, sunlight flickering through the trees, and I wondered when silence had become my only language. I turned the radio up just enough to drown out my thoughts. The music filled the car, polished and controlled, just like everything in that house. By the time I reached the main road, the house had disappeared behind the trees, but her words still echoed in my head, as steady and cold as the morning light. We wish you weren't at your sister's wedding. I drove on, gripping the wheel tighter, watching the city fade in the rearview mirror. Tomorrow I'd leave for Portland. Tonight I just needed to remember how to breathe. By the time I got back to Portland, the gray sky had already started to drizzle, turning the streetlights into blurred halos. My apartment smelled faintly of coffee and camera cables, a mix that always reminded me I was home. I dropped my bag, kicked off my shoes, and turned on my computer. The glow from the monitor filled the dark room, revealing the cluttered chaos of my studio. Stacks of hard drives, notebooks, empty mugs, and a poster from a film festival that had rejected me 2 years ago. On the screen, the title of my latest project glowed in white letters, The Unheard Women, Final Cut. I hit play. The film's last sequence rolled, a woman's voice trembling but steady. They said I was too much. The footage faded to black. I stared at it, my finger hovering over the keyboard, then exhaled. That line still hit me like a bruise I'd stopped pressing but never healed. Too much. It was a phrase that followed me everywhere, from high school teachers who told me to tone it down when I spoke too passionately in debates, to film professors who said my work was emotionally indulgent. Even my own family found ways to say it, just with better manners. The cursor blinked at the end of the credits. I sat there in the blue glow of the screen, the hum of my computer filling the silence. Then a memory crept in uninvited, a flashback. 3 years ago, me sitting across from a film festival curator, a man in his late 50s, with kind eyes that turned sharp when he spoke. Documentaries are better when men make them, he said, tapping his pen on my proposal. They have distance, objectivity. You're too close to your subjects, too emotional. I remembered nodding politely, even thanking him before walking out into the rain. I'd learned early that politeness was armor. A soft ping jolted me back to the present. I turned to my laptop expecting another client invoice or spam about camera rentals. But the subject line made my chest tighten. Congratulations. Your film has been selected for the Miami International Documentary Fest. I opened it, eyes scanning the words twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. October 14th, 15, 2023. I froze, my gaze stuck on the dates. October 15th. The same day Hannah would walk down the aisle. I laughed once, quietly, a sound more like disbelief than joy. Of course, the universe had a twisted sense of timing. For a moment I imagined telling my mom, her polite smile tightening, her voice dripping with concern masked as civility. That's nice, honey, but maybe don't make a big deal about it during the wedding week. The irony was too perfect to ignore. I picked up my phone and texted Lucas. They said yes, Miami. It took him less than a minute to call. The sound of desert wind filled the line. I could hear faint voices in the background camera crew chatter. That's huge, he said out of breath. Wait, Miami. That's the same weekend as Hannah's wedding, right? Yep, a long pause, the kind of silence only someone who knows your whole story can hold. Then, how do you feel about that? I looked at the email again, the official invitation glowing on my screen. My name printed next to official selection. I think there's only one invitation I got, I said finally. He laughed softly. Touché. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The rain tapped lightly against the window, syncing with my heartbeat. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Not joy exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of the universe, drawing a straight line through chaos. Lucas's voice softened. You deserve this, Liv. Don't let them make you feel otherwise. I won't, I said, at least not this time. After we hung up, I sat there letting the silence settle. The cursor blinked on my screen again, patient and waiting. I closed my laptop and glanced around the studio. The posters, the half-finished storyboards, the coffee-stained scripts that had carried me through every rejection. On the wall, an old poster of my first student film hung crooked, the corners curled. Underneath it, someone had written in red marker years ago. Keep going. I didn't even remember who. Maybe me. Maybe Lucas. The heater clicked on, humming low. Cooper lifted his head from the couch, blinking at me sleepily before curling back into a ball. I reached for my notebook, the one I'd used since film school, and flipped through pages filled with sketches, quotes, and production notes. Near the back, where the pages turned soft from use, I found a blank one. I picked up a pen, hesitated, then wrote slowly, Miami, October 13th. Underneath, in smaller letters, don't tell anyone. I stared at the words until the ink bled slightly into the paper. The apartment felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every heartbeat. I closed the notebook, set it on the desk, and looked out the window. The rain had stopped, but the streets shimmered under the lamplight. Somewhere out there, my family was still talking about Hannah's wedding. Maybe my name came up. Maybe it didn't. I didn't mind either way. I reached for my camera, the one I'd saved up for years to buy, and switched it on. The lens cap clicked, the light blinked red. I aimed it at the reflection in the glass. My face faint, framed by raindrops, and hit record. I'm not too much, I whispered. Then I set the camera down, turned off the lights, and let the room go dark, the glow of the monitor fading last. Tomorrow would come with its own noise. Tonight, I wanted silence. Sunday dinners at my parents' house always smelled the same: baked lasagna, garlic bread, and red wine. Familiar, heavy, and a little suffocating. The kind of meal that pretended to be comforting, but always came with a side of judgment. I sat across from my mother, watching her fold her napkin with precision before launching into another monologue about the wedding flowers. Hannah nodded obediently, swirling her wine without drinking it. The dining room light glowed warm and yellow, but everything felt tight, like the air itself was holding its breath. I talked to the florist again, Mom said, gesturing with her fork. We're doing ivory roses instead of blush. Blush is so overdone. That sounds nice, I said, stabbing a piece of lasagna I couldn't taste. And the videographers confirmed. She continued, her tone bright. We hired a professional, so you can just relax. I looked up, my fork halfway to my mouth. I wasn't planning to bring my camera. Good. She smiled tightly, as if my compliance was another box checked. You tend to make people uncomfortable when you film. The words hit with the familiar sharpness of something rehearsed. I saw Hannah glance up, then look back down at her plate, her shoulders stiff. I cut another bite of food, chewed slowly, let the silence stretch. The clink of silverware was the only sound. In my head, I heard my own voice, calm and distant. In this family, silence is survival. Dad cleared his throat, trying to redirect. The house offer came through. We'll be closing next week. I blinked. The house. You're selling it? He nodded, pouring himself another glass of wine. Yes, honey. It'll help with the wedding expenses. The lasagna on my plate suddenly looked unrecognizable. And my name on the title Mom cut in before he could answer. You moved out years ago, dear. Let's not complicate things. She said it like she was brushing lint off a jacket, dismissive, effortless. I stared at her, waiting for my father to step in to say something, anything, but he just smiled weakly, as if apologizing for something small, like forgetting to buy milk. He went back to cutting his steak. The fork slipped from my hand and hit the plate with a sharp clang. Hannah flinched. I'm not hungry, I said, pushing my chair back. Olivia. Dad started, but Mom's hand touched his arm, stopping him. It's fine, she said. She's sensitive about these things. I could feel the heat rise in my chest, the old familiar ache that came whenever she labeled my emotions like a medical condition. Enjoy dinner, I said quietly. I walked out of the dining room through the hallway lined with family photos, graduations, holidays, Hannah's med school, white coat ceremony. Every frame carefully chosen. None of me past the age of 22. Outside, the rain had started soft but steady. I stood under the porch light, arms crossed, breathing in the smell of wet cedar. Cooper was waiting by the steps, tail wagging lazily, as if sensing I needed company. Through the window, I could see them still at the table. Mom was talking again, hands gesturing in that precise way she always did when things went according to plan. Hannah nodded, eyes fixed on her wine. Dad sat quietly, his shoulders slumped, pretending to listen. He looked up once. Our eyes met through the glass. For a moment, I thought he might get up, come outside, say something real. But he didn't. He just gave that same strained smile, the one that said he wished he were braver, and turned back to his plate. I stepped off the porch into the rain. The cold drops soaked through my hair, sliding down my back. But I didn't move. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, stretching shadows in long lines across the driveway. It was strange how easily a house could stop being home. One dinner, one conversation, and suddenly it was just four walls, holding memories you didn't recognize anymore. Cooper barked softly, shaking the water from his fur. I crouched down, ran a hand over his head. "Guess it's just us again," I murmured. The rain grew heavier. Somewhere inside, the clink of dishes echoed faintly as they cleared the table, laughter following in short, rehearsed bursts. The sound was muffled, distant, like a show playing behind glass. I straightened, looking toward the window one last time. The porch light flickered against the rain. Being erased from the dinner table was just the beginning. This time they were erasing me from the story entirely. I turned and started walking down the sidewalk, rain seeping into my shoes, the night pressing close. My reflection shimmered on the wet asphalt, alone, steady, unbent. The further I walked, the quieter the house became, until all I could hear was the rhythm of the rain and my own footsteps keeping time with it. I didn't look back. The studio lights buzzed faintly above us, a soft, electric hum blending with the rhythmic clicking of the keyboard. The only other sound came from the editing software, looping through the same 5 seconds of footage. On screen, a woman's face, lined brave, spoke into the camera. "They said I was too much." I paused the video, the frame freezing mid-sentence. Her eyes stared back at me, raw and unflinching. Lucas leaned against the table beside me, sipping coffee gone cold. "You know," he said, watching the screen, "this feels different from your other work. It's not about pain anymore. It's about voice." I kept my eyes on the monitor. Maybe they're the same thing. He didn't respond right away. The glow from the screen painted the room in blue. Outside, Portland's fall rain tapped lightly against the window, the kind of sound that made you feel both safe and exposed at once. Lucas set the mug down and stretched. "So for the ending, do we go with music or leave it bare?" I clicked through the sound files, scrolling past dozens of instrumental tracks, none of which felt right. Music always tells people how to feel. I said, maybe they should sit in it for a while. Just silence. "Let's make it simple," he said quietly. "Let them hear the silence." I smiled faintly, eyes still on the monitor. That's all I ever had. For a while, neither of us spoke. I adjusted, color grading, cutting between interviews. Women sitting in kitchens, hallways, cars, telling their stories in voices that trembled at first, then steadied. The hum of the hard drive filled the space where conversation should have been. I rested my hand on the mouse, watching the light from the screen flicker across my fingers. It felt familiar. The same quiet concentration I'd had since I was a kid, with a cheap camcorder and a need to capture something real. And like a tide pulling me backward, the memory came. I was 10, standing in the kitchen with that tiny plastic camera I'd begged for on my birthday. My mom was icing a cake, Hannah beside her covered in flour laughing. I filmed them, proud of my framing, the way sunlight hit the frosting just right. "Mom, look," I said. "You look so pretty in this light." She turned sharply. Face tightening. "Stop filming! You're making a mess!" I froze, the weight of the camera suddenly heavy in my hands. Hannah giggled nervously, brushing flour off her apron. Mom sighed softer this time. "Put that thing down, Olivia. You don't need to record everything." Back then, I didn't understand that she wasn't just talking about the camera. The memory faded, and I was back in the studio. Lucas was watching me, his expression thoughtful. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, blinking the past away. "Yeah, just thinking about how long it took me to get here." He gave a small grin. "You've earned every second." We kept working, trimming clips, balancing audio. The room dimmed as daylight disappeared, the glow from the monitors, turning the space into a cocoon of blue and amber. My eyes burned, but I didn't stop. Hours slipped by like minutes. At some point, Lucas disappeared into the small kitchenette, returning with 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper. He handed me one without a word. "Thanks," I said. "You'd forget to eat if I didn't show up," he teased lightly. Probably, I admitted. When the last cut rendered, I leaned back, stretching my neck. The film was done. Truly done this time. The timeline glowed green across the bottom of the screen. Final Cut wasn't just a label anymore. It was a declaration. Lucas stood, rubbing his hands together. "I'll upload it tonight. Deadline's in 2 days." I nodded, exhausted, but restless. "You think it'll stand a chance?" "Of course," he said. "It's honest. People feel honesty." He started typing at the computer behind me, his focus intense. I assumed he was uploading the file like he said. I didn't notice the printer start humming until a single sheet of paper slid out warm and crisp. Lucas grabbed it before I could see. "What's that?" I asked. Nothing, he said too quickly, folding it once before pinning it to the corkboard by his desk. Curiosity got the better of me. I stood and walked over. The paper was a confirmation receipt, submission to the Portland Independent Film Awards, under a new category, Best Female Director. I turned to him. "You entered it under my name." He shrugged, pretending to scroll through emails. "You deserve to be seen, Liv. You've been hiding behind other people's projects long enough." I stared at the paper again. The bold black letters spelling my name, Olivia Reed. "You believe in me more than they ever did," I said softly. He looked up, meeting my eyes. That's how it should be. Something shifted in my chest then. Not quite warmth, not quite ache. Maybe both. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the window in a steady rhythm. The studio lights flickered once before stabilizing. I saved the file one last time, closed the project, and watched the screen fade to black. Lucas yawned, stretching his arms behind his head. "That's enough for one night." "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't ready to leave. He grabbed his jacket and gave me a tired smile. "Lock up when you go." When the door clicked shut behind him, the silence felt different, deeper, like it belonged to me now. I turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the monitors glowing. Their blue reflections stretched across the walls and over my face. I stared at it for a long time, the faint hum of the computer, the only sound left in the world. This was my space, my light, my story. And for once I didn't feel the need to apologize for taking up the room. The sound of my email notification pulled me out of sleep before the sun had fully climbed over the Portland skyline. My apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old heater and the soft click of Cooper's nails on the hardwood floor. I reached for my laptop still half under the blanket and opened my inbox. At the top sat a new message, bold and unread. Subject: official invitation, Miami International Documentary Fest, 2023. I blinked twice before clicking. The message opened formal and clean, signed by Patrick Moore, Festival Director. "Your film speaks for those who were never heard." For a moment, I just stared at that line. It sat there in the center of the screen, simple but heavy. I reread the sentence 3 times, as if the words might disappear if I looked away too long. The festival's logo shimmered at the bottom of the page, waves and film reels intertwined in blue. Below it, the dates glared back at me, October 14th, 15. My stomach tightened. October 15th, the same day Hannah would walk down the aisle. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath that felt like it had been trapped for months. The early morning light slanted through the window, turning the air gold and still. Cooper jumped into my lap, curling into a warm ball, his head resting on my knee. I scratched behind his ear and whispered, "Well, looks like we're going to Miami." My first instinct was to text Hannah. For a brief second, I imagined what that might look like, telling her I'd been invited to a major film festival, that my work would be screened alongside directors I'd admired for years. Maybe she'd be proud. Maybe she'd even understand. I opened my messages, typed a few words. "Hey, guess what?" And then stopped. What would she say? "That's amazing, Liv, but please don't post anything that weekend. It might distract from the wedding." I deleted the message. I used to ask for permission to exist in their world. Now I just needed to give myself permission to live in mine. My phone buzzed again, another message. This time from Hannah. "Wish you could be here that weekend. It'll be beautiful." The irony hit me like a slow echo. I typed a reply and stared at it for a full minute before hitting send. So will mine. I left the laptop open and walked to the kitchen. The smell of coffee grounds filled the air as I started the machine, the rhythmic drip soothing in its own way. I looked around my apartment, half studio, half home. Storyboards pinned to the wall, cables snaking across the floor. A framed photograph of Hannah and me as kids sitting on the windowsill. Her in a yellow sundress, me holding a camcorder twice the size of my hands. We looked inseparable then. Now it just looked like a memory that belonged to someone else. When the coffee was done, I poured it into my favorite chipped mug and returned to my desk. The invitation email was still glowing on the screen. I clicked print and the machine hummed to life. The paper slid out, warm, smelling faintly of ink and promise. I pinned it on the corkboard above my desk, right next to that old photo of us. 2 sisters, one invited, one not. The front door opened a few minutes later, and Lucas stepped in, balancing 2 to-go cups from the cafe downstairs. His hair was still damp from the rain. "You're up early," he said, handing me one. "I got the official invitation." He grinned wide and genuine. "Miami, baby. That's big." I nodded, staring at the screen again. It feels different this time. You look nervous. I'm fine, I said. But my voice didn't sound convincing. It just feels like my turn finally came. He leaned against the desk, watching me for a long moment. Then, let's make it count. The simplicity of his words sank in. That was one of the things I loved most about Lucas. He didn't make big speeches. He just believed. Cooper barked once, breaking the moment. Lucas laughed and bent down to pet him. See? Even he agrees. I smiled, sipping the coffee. The bitterness grounded me. For the rest of the morning, we talked logistics, flight times, screening schedules, who would handle the Q&A. Lucas offered to come with me, but I shook my head. You've got that Arizona project. Besides, I'll be fine. He looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just said, You always are. After he left, I opened my laptop again and navigated to the airline website. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Departure date October 13th, return October 18th. The cursor blinked beside the confirmation field, steady and waiting. I hesitated for only a second before typing in my credit card number. My fingers trembled slightly as I hit submit. The loading bar spun and then, booking confirmed. The golden light from the window hit the screen, reflecting across my face. It felt almost symbolic, though I wasn't sure of what yet. I sat back staring at the confirmation email, now sitting in my inbox. The ticket to Miami, to the festival, to something that finally belonged only to me. Cooper barked again, breaking my focus, tail wagging like he sensed my unease. I reached down to pet him. We're really doing this, huh? The city outside was waking up now. Cars humming on Burnside, the low whistle of a train in the distance. Somewhere my mother was probably at brunch talking about floral arrangements. Hannah was likely fitting her veil. Their lives were already scripted, polished, pre-approved. Mine was finally unscripted. I looked again at the corkboard, the invitation next to our childhood photo. The edges of the paper fluttered slightly under the breeze from the window. Two worlds side by side, separated by time, by expectation, by choice. And, for the first time, I didn't feel like I was missing from theirs. I just felt like I was finally in mine. The clock on my desk ticked softly. I finished my coffee, stood up, and opened the window a little wider. The crisp October air rushed in cool and clear. There it was, the sound of my own life unfolding exactly as it should. The heat hit me the second we stepped out of the terminal, thick, heavy, and shimmering like it had a pulse of its own. Miami air always carried salt in it, even miles from the beach. I dragged my suitcase toward the taxi line, sunglasses barely cutting the glare. Lucas walked beside me, camera bag slung across his chest. His usual calm offsetting my nervous energy. Feels good to be back in the sun, he said. Feels like too much sun, I muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from my neck. As we got into the cab, the driver leaned out the window. Where to? The Marlin Downtown Hotel, I said. He nodded, pulling into traffic. The city stretched out around us, pastel buildings, palm trees, bending in the ocean wind. Billboards advertising beach weddings and luxury condos. Through the window, a sign flashed by Eden Shore Wedding Resort. I felt the words before I processed them. The name looked familiar because it was the same one Hannah had gushed about over dinner months ago. I stared as the resort slipped out of view, sunlight glinting off its white arches. Lucas glanced over. Wasn't that— Yeah, I said quietly. We didn't speak for a moment. The driver hummed along to the radio. I watched the palm trees blur past, thinking how strange it was that the same city could hold both of our stories, hers and mine, at the same time. They were there just a few miles away, close enough that if the wind blew the right way, I could probably hear the wedding band warming up. When we reached the hotel, Patrick Moore was already waiting in the lobby. He was tall, well-dressed, and somehow managed to make a clipboard look like a fashion accessory. Olivia Reed, he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. It's good to finally meet the woman behind the film. You've created something special. Thank you, I said, smiling politely. Your screening's tomorrow night, he continued. You're in great company this year. Some incredible directors. Lucas raised a brow. She belongs in that company. Patrick smiled. I couldn't agree more. He handed me a packet with event details, then moved on to greet another filmmaker across the lobby. I watched him walk away, my nerves starting to hum again. We took the elevator up to our floor. The hallway smelled faintly of sea air and cleaning supplies. Our room overlooked downtown where the glass towers caught the light and threw it back at the ocean. Lucas dropped his bag on the bed. You okay? Yeah, I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing. It's just weird being here. Because of them. I didn't answer. He didn't press. That was one of the things I loved most about him. Later that afternoon, we walked down to the beach to shoot some B-roll footage for a side project he was working on. The sand was blinding the sky impossibly blue. He filmed palm trees swaying people walking barefoot through shallow water, the horizon melting into the clouds. I wandered a few feet away, shoes in hand, the ocean pulling gently at the edges of my dress. The water was warm, almost too warm. You ever think they'll watch your film one day? Lucas called out, camera still rolling. I turned back the sunlight behind him, making his outline blur. I think they already are, I said. In ways they don't even know. He smiled, lowering the camera. That's poetic, Reed. I've had practice. By evening, the festival welcome party was in full swing. The hotel's rooftop glowed with fairy lights strung over white linen tables. Laughter mixed with the sound of clinking glasses, and a jazz trio playing softly near the bar. I'd never liked these events. Too many smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Too many people saying brilliant work when they hadn't seen the film. I was halfway through my second glass of wine when I heard a voice behind me. Olivia Reed. I was wondering if we'd run into each other. I turned, already knowing who it was before I saw her. Eleanor Price. The woman whose rejection letter I'd memorized word for word 5 years ago. She looked exactly as I remembered. Perfect posture, silver hair pinned in place, eyes sharp, but not unkind. Eleanor, I said, keeping my voice steady. She gave a measured smile. You've come a long way. I stopped waiting for approval, I said before I could stop myself. Her smile widened slightly like she appreciated the honesty. Good. You shouldn't have been waiting in the first place. For a beat, we just looked at each other, two people who'd once stood on opposite sides of the same locked door. Then she said, I'd love to talk after the screening. There's a project I think you'd be perfect for. I nodded, too surprised to say much else. Sure. I'd like that. When she drifted away into the crowd, Lucas appeared at my side, a drink in hand. That looked intense. Eleanor Price just told me she wants to talk about a project. He grinned. See, karma works fast sometimes. I laughed, but it came out soft, more disbelief than humor. Yeah, maybe. We left the party early. Back in the room, I stepped out onto the balcony, letting the humid night air wrap around me. In the distance, the city lights shimmered, blending with faint music drifting from the beach. I leaned against the railing, looking out over Miami's sprawl. The bridges, the water, the skyline pulsing like a heartbeat. Beyond it, maybe 10 miles down, I could almost see the glow of the resort lights. 2 worlds, 1 city. One chasing perfection. One chasing truth. Lucas came out behind me, his hand brushing my shoulder. Big day tomorrow, he said. I nodded, eyes still fixed on the horizon. Yeah. It's strange, though. I thought I'd feel nervous, but I don't. What do you feel? Still. He smiled. That's a good place to be. When I finally closed the balcony door, the lights from outside cast long lines across the floor. I drew the curtains shut, the last shimmer of the wedding resort fading into shadow. The room fell quiet, the city's noise reduced to a hum beneath it all. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running away from something. I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be, calm, grounded, and ready for whatever came next. The morning light in Miami was soft and golden, spilling across the hotel balcony, and catching the edge of my dress as it hung by the door. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen, and the distant sound of gulls mixed with faint laughter drifting up from the street below. Somewhere miles down the coast, Hannah was waking up to her wedding day. Same city, same hour, same sunset waiting at the end of it. One world preparing for vows, another for something I'd waited my whole life to say. I sat at the small desk by the window, sipping coffee that had already gone cold. The city outside was shimmering with motion, vendors setting up umbrellas, taxis, honking tourists in linen shirts heading toward the beach. It was the kind of morning that looked like a postcard. Lucas adjusted his camera straps across his shoulders, checking the lenses in their compartments. You ready? I smiled faintly. As I'll ever be. He grinned, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You look like you belong on a movie poster. That's because I'm terrified. Patrick Moore knocked on the door, then clipboard in hand, his trademark energy buzzing through the frame. "House is packed tonight," he said. "You're closing the session. Big crowd, a lot of press." I laughed softly mostly, to keep from showing how much my stomach twisted at the thought. "No pressure." Patrick winked. "You'll crush it. Trust me." After he left, Lucas watched me quietly for a moment, then said, "You realize this is it, right? All the years, all the people who said no, you outlasted them." I'm trying to believe that I said, turning toward the window again. "It's strange. They spent so long telling me to stay home. And now a whole room's waiting to hear you speak," he finished for me. "They told me to stay home. Now an entire theater is waiting for me to show up." The day passed in a blur of small details, checking the sound design one last time, signing release forms, eating a sandwich I barely tasted. Around sunset, the world outside the hotel began to glow. Miami light has a way of making everything feel cinematic. Streets, gleaming buildings, blushing gold. Meanwhile, at a resort not far away, my family was posing for photos. I could almost see it if I closed my eyes. Hannah, in her white dress. Mom adjusting the veil, Dad fumbling with his boutonniere. I didn't feel jealous, just curious. How did they sound when they said my name that morning? Did they say it at all? By the time we arrived at the theater, the red carpet was buzzing with camera flashes and murmured introductions. Lucas stayed behind the scenes, blending into the crowd with his gear. Patrick ushered me backstage, his voice cutting through the noise. "You'll go on right after the short from Mexico," he said. "You good?" I nodded. My palms were damp, my heart beat quick. As the lights dimmed, I stepped into the wings and watched the crowd find their seats. The projection light flickered across the room, catching dust in the air like fireflies. On the opposite side of the city, Hannah was stepping onto the sand bouquet, trembling slightly in her hands. Mom's voice hovered behind her. "Smile softer. Shoulders down." Dad adjusted his tie, the flowers pinned crookedly to his lapel. The officiant began to speak. At the same moment, in a darkened theater, my film began to play. The first image appeared. An old woman sitting by a window, her voice breaking as she said, "They told me to be quiet, so I learned how to speak louder." The audience fell silent. Even the hum of air conditioning seemed to stop. For 40 minutes, I didn't breathe. Each line of dialogue, each cut of footage, was a heartbeat I had lived through. When the credits rolled, the lights stayed low for a few long seconds. The silence was unbearable. And then, like a wave, breaking applause erupted. It started softly, then built until it filled every corner of the room. People were standing, whistling, clapping so hard it echoed in my chest. Patrick's voice rose above it, and the award for Best Emerging Director 2023 goes to... He paused just long enough for me to hear my own pulse in my ears. Olivia Reed. For a second, I couldn't move. Lucas touched my shoulder lightly, the way someone steadies a glass before it overflows. "Go," he whispered. I stood. The applause got louder. My hands shook as I made my way to the stage, the lights almost blinding. Patrick handed me the award, grinning. The microphone felt strange in my hands, too heavy and too light all at once. The crowd blurred. My vision tunneled. Somewhere out on the beach, Hannah was cutting her wedding cake under a canopy of sparklers, laughter, and music surrounding her. In the theater, I raised my head, swallowed hard, and smiled. They said I didn't belong there. But maybe I was never meant to fit in their frame. Maybe this light, this moment, was where I belonged all along. I could feel the tears starting to build, but they didn't fall. Not yet. I gripped the award tighter, the metal cool against my palm, and looked out at the crowd. In another life, I might have thought of what I'd lost. But in this one, all I could think about was how it finally felt to be seen. Somewhere fireworks went off over the ocean. The colors lit up the sky outside the theater, a reflection of both worlds colliding, white gold and shimmering. At the resort, Hannah laughed as the sparklers flared her new husband's arm around her waist. At the theater, I smiled into the blinding lights holding my first award. 2 worlds, 1 night, and for the first time I didn't feel divided between them. I simply existed in mine. The lights were blinding. I could feel the heat of them on my face, the weight of every eye in the room focused on me. My hands trembled just enough that I tightened my grip on the microphone to hide it. The metal felt cold, grounding. I took a slow breath, the kind you take before stepping off a ledge you've been staring at for years. My parents once said they wished I wasn't at my sister's wedding. The words echoed through the theater sharper than I expected. I paused, let them hang there. Somewhere in the crowd, someone drew in a quiet breath. Maybe they were right. I continued. I wasn't meant to be a guest. I was meant to create something worth celebrating. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the sound built like a rising wave. Applause, cheers, a few whistles from the back rows. I blinked against the brightness, trying to steady myself as people stood clapping harder, louder. I spotted Patrick near the stage, beaming. Lucas stood in the aisle, camera in hand, a proud smile spreading across his face. The spotlight washed everything else away until it was just light sound and that strange floating calm that follows release. From the front row, a woman stood. Ava Morales, a journalist I'd met briefly during registration. She lifted her phone, recording her eyes glassy. I didn't think much of it then. When they tried to silence me, the world chose to listen instead. After the ceremony ended, people swarmed me. Handshakes, congratulations, flashes from cameras. I smiled until my face hurt, said, "Thank you," so many times it stopped sounding like English. Lucas slipped through the crowd, wrapping his arm around me from behind. "You did it," he whispered. "Feels unreal. It's real. You just changed everything." We left the theater together, the humid Miami air clinging to our skin. The night buzzed with energy laughter, spilling out of the after-party across the street. My phone buzzed with notifications, but I ignored it. I just wanted a moment of quiet, of stillness. We walked to the end of the block where the sea breeze reached us soft and salty. I leaned against a railing, the award still in my hand, heavy but comforting. Lucas looked at me with that familiar half-smile. "You know this speech. It's going to be talked about." I laughed. "Yeah, maybe by 5 people. More like 5,000, he said. "You don't realize what you just said, do you?" I shook my head, half amused, half exhausted. It wasn't planned. It just came out. Sometimes the truth does. We stood there for a while, listening to the distant echo of the festival band warming up the ocean's rhythm underneath it. It was perfect in its own unplanned way. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the wedding reception was in full swing at Eden Shore Resort. Fairy lights glittered along the beach, guests danced barefoot in the sand, and the band played a soft cover of "Can't Help Falling in Love." At one of the tables, a woman in a coral dress scrolled through her phone, pausing when a video appeared on her Twitter feed. Me standing under harsh lights saying those words. She turned her screen toward Hannah. "Isn't this your sister?" Hannah froze. On the small screen, I smiled faintly before the clip cut to black. Behind me in the video, the audience was standing applauding. Hannah's voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, that's her." Margaret leaned in wineglass in hand. "What are you watching?" The woman handed over the phone. Margaret stared at it for only a few seconds before her face drained of color. She said that, "On stage about us." Her voice cracked, trembling more with disbelief than anger. Hannah took the phone back, hitting replay. On screen, my face looked calm, almost peaceful. The crowd's applause filled the air again. Charles reached across the table, gently touching Margaret's arm. "Just let it play." But Margaret didn't. She set the phone down, her knuckles white around the stem of her glass. Back at the festival, I was still shaking hands, smiling for photos, unaware of the parallel unfolding just miles away. The sounds of clinking glasses and waves at the resort merged with the cheers and camera flashes inside the theater. 2 sounds that never met before, applause and celebration. 2 lives running side by side like film reels finally aligned. Ava stood off to the side, phone still in hand. The recording was already uploading, her caption simple. "When family silences, you let the world hear you." Within minutes, retweets began to multiply. 100, then 1,000, then 10. The clip found its rhythm online, spreading faster than anyone could control. By the time Lucas and I returned to the hotel, I'd taken off my heels and carried them in one hand, laughing softly at how unreal everything felt. We passed the concierge, who nodded with recognition. "Congratulations," he said. "Thanks." I replied, the words small, but sincere. In the elevator, Lucas leaned against the mirrored wall. "You're officially the face of the festival," he teased. "Don't jinx it." He smiled, eyes tired, but happy. "You earned it." We reached our floor, stepping out into the quiet hallway. I didn't notice my phone still buzzing in my purse. Inside the room, I set the award down on the dresser. The light from the city poured through the window, glittering across the surface. I stood there for a moment watching my reflection overlap with its gold shine. Lucas came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You okay?" "I think so." He rested his chin on my shoulder. "You sure?" I smiled, closing my eyes. "For the first time, yeah." We stayed that way for a while, just breathing. The world outside kept moving, screens lighting up, strangers sharing a video that would reach 1 million views before dawn. But in that small room, all I felt was peace. I didn't know yet that my words had already escaped the walls of the theater, that somewhere on a beach just down the coast my family was watching the same moment from a different world. I only knew that for once I wasn't performing for anyone. I was just living in the light that had finally found me. 3 days later, Portland was gray again. The air was cool and damp, clouds hanging low enough to blur the top of the Fremont Bridge. I pushed open my apartment door, suitcase still rolling behind me, and before I could take another step, Cooper launched himself at my leg's tail, wagging furiously. His joy felt like an anchor pulling me back to something normal. "Hey, buddy," I said, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears. "Miss me?" He barked once, circling me as if to scold me for being gone so long. I laughed softly. Exhaustion sinking into my bones. The place smelled faintly of rain and stale coffee. I set the award on the kitchen counter, its gold surface catching the weak sunlight. For a second, it looked like a strange visitor, out of place in my tiny, cluttered home. My phone buzzed again, and again. Then it started vibrating so constantly that I finally pulled it from my bag. The screen lit up with a flood of notifications: Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, news alerts. The girl who wasn't invited. The hashtag glowed at the top of every feed. I froze, staring at it. Before I could process, the phone rang. Ava Morales' name flashed across the screen. I answered, my voice hoarse. "Hey, Olivia," she said, sounding half out of breath. "You're everywhere. Variety just ran a headline about your speech. The video's got over 8 million views. People are calling it the speech heard around the internet." I sank onto the couch, one hand covering my mouth. What I told you had hit something universal. Ava continued. "You've got morning shows asking for interviews, blogs dissecting every line. Hell, even Netflix tweeted about it." I laughed, the sound uncertain, shaky. "You're kidding. I wish. You're trending in 3 countries. Lucas walked in from the kitchen, still unpacking gear. "What's going on?" I held the phone out so he could hear. Ava's voice spilled through the speaker. "She's viral," Ava said. Without even trying, Lucas grinned, leaning on the counter. "You realize you just went viral without trying?" I shook my head, laughing again, though it came out somewhere between disbelief and nerves. "I didn't plan this." "Of course you didn't," he said, sitting beside me. "That's why it worked. Karma doesn't need a hand to guide it. It just waits for the right moment to show up." Ava was still talking about potential interviews and PR opportunities, but her words blurred into background noise. I looked around the apartment, same walls, same pictures, same window view, and yet everything felt different. The world outside suddenly knew my name, my story, my family's words. When I hung up, silence filled the room again. Lucas reached over and squeezed my hand. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, staring at the phone still buzzing on the table. "I just didn't expect it to be this fast. It's not a bad thing, Liv. No, but it's a lot." He nodded. "Then take a breath. Let it be what it is." I leaned my head against the couch, closing my eyes for a moment. The hum of the fridge mixed with the soft sound of rain starting outside. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. Across the country in Seattle, my mother's voice shattered the calm of another home. "This has to stop." Margaret snapped into the phone. "They're making us look like villains." Hannah's voice came through faintly from the other end, tired but firm. "Mom, it's just people talking. Maybe they're not wrong." "Don't say that." Margaret hissed. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to our family? I can't even go to church without someone mentioning her name." "It's been 3 days," Hannah said. "Maybe it's time to stop caring what everyone else thinks." There was a sharp silence. Then the sound of a phone slamming down. Margaret stood by the kitchen counter, hands trembling, staring at the newspaper headline in front of her. The woman her family didn't want at the wedding. Wins Miami Award. She turned the page over, but the words burned through. Her reflection in the oven glass looked unfamiliar. Drawn, frightened, and older than she remembered being. In the living room, Charles sat on the couch with his laptop open. The video was paused mid-frame. Me standing on stage, eyes steady, the spotlight bright behind me. He pressed play again. When it ended, he sat still for a long time. Then quietly, he picked up the phone and dialed my number. It rang once before I answered. "Dad." I watched it, he said, his voice soft, almost fragile. "You were incredible." I didn't say anything. For a while, neither of us spoke. All I could hear was his breathing. Slow, uneven, the sound of someone carrying words they'd never said aloud. "Thank you," I whispered finally. He exhaled a shaky sound that wasn't quite relief. "Your mother's upset, but she'll come around, eventually." I didn't answer. We both knew he didn't believe that. "Take care of yourself," he said after a pause. "I'm proud of you." The line went quiet. I stared at the phone for a long time before setting it down. The apartment was dark except for the glow from my laptop. I turned it on and opened one of the news articles. Screenshots of my speech headlines filled with words like bravery, defiance, redemption. I read each one without really absorbing the meaning. It felt strange seeing my life reduced to captions, my pain repackaged into something inspirational for strangers. Cooper hopped onto the couch beside me, curling up against my side. His warmth was steady real. I rested my hand on his fur and stared at the reflection of the screen in the window. My face looked calm, illuminated by the blue light. Justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels like quiet. The apartment felt both fuller and emptier than it had ever been. The world outside knew my story now, but inside I was just a woman sitting in a small Portland apartment, lit by the glow of something she never meant to set on fire. The rain fell harder against the windows, the rhythm steady and slow. I sat there until the screen dimmed and went black, leaving only my faint reflection behind, half shadow, half light. A week later, the world had only gotten louder. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating, a constant stream of notifications, mentions, and messages from people I didn't know. The same 30-second clip of me on stage had multiplied into 1,000 versions. Different angles, subtitles in 5 languages, reaction videos layered with commentary. I sat at my desk staring at the chaos on my screen. The phone rang again. It was Casey, my PR manager. Her voice bright with exhaustion. "You've officially broken the internet," she said. "The clips are being reposted on every platform. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, even LinkedIn. You're trending across all age groups." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "That's not exactly something I planned." "Doesn't matter," Casey said. "People see you as this symbol, like you said something they've been too afraid to say, or something they'll twist however they want." She hesitated, her voice softening. "You can't control it now. Just breathe, okay? This is the good kind of chaos." After she hung up, I set the phone down, but it buzzed again almost immediately. A message from Ava. "A blogger's planning to analyze your speech. She's good. Don't freak out." I clicked the link she sent. The thumbnail showed a woman with curly hair and kind eyes framed by a bookshelf. Lydia Grant, Modern Family Truths. Her voice filled the screen. "When parents silence you, the internet speaks." She played my clip, then paused it mid-sentence. "This isn't just about a wedding. It's about emotional erasure, about generational silencing. When you tell someone they're too much, what you're really saying is, 'Your truth makes me uncomfortable.'" I listened, quietly, not moving. She wasn't sensationalizing it. She was unpacking it with empathy. The video went viral, in hours half the internet praising her insight, the other half arguing about whether I'd betrayed my family for attention. When justice arrives, it doesn't knock. It kicks the door open and floods every screen. Meanwhile, the Reed family had become a topic of fascination. Reporters tracked down old photos, family acquaintances, even my high school yearbook quotes. In Seattle, my mother was living through her own reckoning. Margaret walked through the grocery store feeling the stares before she even reached the produce aisle. Her church friends had stopped calling. At Sunday service, the pew beside her sat empty. Charles had retreated into silence, too. He no longer checked his phone, barely left the house. He told people he had the flu, but everyone knew it wasn't true. Back in Portland, I sat in a cafe near Hawthorne Boulevard, the kind of place with chipped mugs and mismatched chairs. The smell of cinnamon and espresso clung to the air. Lucas sat across from me, his laptop open, editing a new reel. I opened my email and froze. Subject: collaboration proposal. Redwood Films. It was from the same company that had rejected my documentary years ago, claiming it was too emotional, too niche. Now their tone was different. We'd love to collaborate on your next project. Your recent success has inspired us to reach out. The industry needs more voices like yours. I couldn't help it. I laughed softly at first, then louder. People turned to look, but I didn't care. Lucas glanced up. Good news. You could say that, I said, sliding the laptop toward him. He read the email, then smirked. Karma's got a sense of humor. Yeah, I said, stirring my coffee. Apparently it's also punctual. He leaned back in his chair. So, are you gonna say yes? I looked out the window. The rain had started again, soft and rhythmic, tracing thin silver lines down the glass. I don't know, I said finally. Maybe silence was my best work yet. He smiled. I don't believe that for a second. Neither did I. But it felt good to say it. A few minutes later, my phone lit up again. Unknown number. The country code wasn't domestic. I hesitated, then answered. Olivia Reed. A familiar voice said, warm and measured. This is Eleanor Price. I straightened in my seat. Eleanor, hi. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, she said. I just wanted to tell you. I meant what I said in Miami. I'm curating a new international project about women redefining storytelling. We're partnering with the BBC and Sundance. I'd like you to be part of it. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I glanced at Lucas, who raised an eyebrow. That's incredible, I said finally. I don't even know what to say. Eleanor laughed softly. Say yes, Olivia. The world's already listening. When the call ended, I stared at my phone for a long time, feeling the strange symmetry of it all. They once said I was too emotional to make films. But emotion was the thing that made the world finally hear me. Lucas reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You okay? I nodded. Still dazed. Yeah. Just realizing I don't have to chase approval anymore. It's already caught up to me. He smiled. Told you karma's got good timing. Outside, the rain lightened into mist, the clouds parting just enough for a thin line of sunlight to break through. I watched it catch the rim of my coffee cup, a shimmer of gold against porcelain, fragile and perfect. For the first time, the noise of the world didn't feel heavy. It just felt like proof that silence had finally found its echo. The rain had been steady all afternoon, the kind that softened the edges of everything outside. My apartment smelled faintly of coffee and wet pavement. I sat at my desk reviewing new footage for a short documentary. Interviews about forgiveness of all things, when my laptop chimed. A video call request flashed on the screen. Hannah. For a second, I just stared at it. We hadn't spoken since before the festival. The cursor blinked over the green accept button like it was daring me to click. I took a breath and did. Her face filled the screen, tired but kind, framed by loose strands of hair that had slipped out of her ponytail. She was still wearing her white coat, the hospital logo embroidered over her name. I saw your film, she said softly. It was beautiful. For a moment, I couldn't find words. The rain tapped against the window, filling the silence. Thank you, I said finally. She smiled, small and hesitant. I wish you had been there. So do I said, then after a beat. But maybe we both needed to see things differently first. We sat in the quiet that followed, not awkward exactly, just waited. She looked around as if to ground herself. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of hospital lockers and the soft glow of fluorescent light. Cooper jumped onto the couch beside me, tail thumping against the cushions. He barked once, a quick, sharp sound that broke the stillness. Hannah laughed first, then I did too. The sound felt lighter than I expected. Still have that dog, she said. Yeah, he's the one thing that doesn't judge me. Smart dog. We smiled at each other, the kind of smile that belongs to people who used to finish each other's sentences. After a moment, Hannah's expression shifted quieter. Mom's been different lately. Different how... She's not angry anymore. Just quiet. I think she saw the talk show about your film. The one where that critic said you changed how people think about family. I looked down at my hands, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. That's enough, I said. Sometimes silence is louder than sorry. Hannah nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe it is. Lightning flashed outside, followed by a low rumble of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the glass. She leaned closer to the camera. You know, I thought about you that day. The wedding, yeah. I kept wondering what it would have been like if you were there. I think part of me was waiting for you to show up anyway. My throat tightened. If I had shown up, Mom would have made sure I disappeared before dessert. She laughed gently. Probably. Then after a pause. But it wouldn't have mattered. Everyone was asking about you. Even Grandma kept saying you were always the brave one. Brave or stubborn. Depends who you ask. I don't know, she said, smiling. I think those two things might be the same. We both went quiet again. The rain grew heavier, drumming on the glass like a heartbeat. For the first time, the silence between us didn't hurt. It just existed. She reached off screen for her phone. I sent you something. My laptop pinged a second later. A photo appeared in my inbox. Hannah, in her wedding dress, standing barefoot in the sand. The sky behind her was streaked with pink and gold. Underneath, she'd written, "For the record, I'd be proud to call you my sister anywhere." I stared at it for a long time. Her smile in the photo wasn't the perfect one from the wedding magazines. It was softer, almost fragile. Real. "Thank you," I said quietly. She looked up at me through the screen. "You're welcome." There was so much I could have said then, about the years we'd lost the way I'd built walls because it was safer than asking to be seen, but none of it seemed necessary anymore. Forgiveness doesn't always need an apology. Sometimes it's just seeing what the other person finally sees too. We talked for another few minutes about ordinary things. Her shifts at the hospital, my new project, Cooper's latest obsession with chasing pigeons. It felt easy, almost normal. When we said goodbye, she waved with a tired smile and promised to call again soon. The screen went dark, her face replaced by my own reflection. Older, maybe, but lighter somehow. I leaned back, the hum of the laptop fading into the sound of the rain. On the desk beside my coffee mug lay a photo I hadn't looked at in years. Me and Hannah as kids, sitting on the front porch, with melted popsicles dripping down our hands. I picked it up, tracing the edges where the paper had curled. Her hair had been in braids. I'd been holding my first camera plastic and scratched, but grinning like I owned the world. I smiled at the memory, at the proof that once before, all the noise, it had just been the two of us. No sides, no silence, no need to prove who belonged where. The rain outside softened again, slowing to a steady rhythm. Cooper jumped off the couch and curled up by my feet. I reached out and turned off the laptop. The reflection of the screen faded from the window, leaving only the faint light of the city behind it. For the first time in a long while, I felt something simple and rare. Peace. A year later, Los Angeles felt like another lifetime. The city was glowing the way it always did before dusk. Hazy gold lights spilling over glass buildings, the hum of traffic soft underneath. The conference banner above the hotel entrance read, "Women Who Spoke Anyway." I stood behind the curtain, microphone in hand, waiting for my cue. Through the gap in the stage drapes, I could see hundreds of faces, rows of chairs, filled with women from every corner of the industry. Writers, filmmakers, journalists, dreamers. Some of them held notebooks. Some just looked tired, but determined. I knew that look. When they called my name, I walked out slowly, the lights blooming around me. The applause rolled through the room like a soft wave. I smiled, adjusting the microphone. "They wished I wasn't there," I began. My voice echoed slightly, steady and low. But I learned, being unseen doesn't mean being invisible. A hush fell over the room. I could see it land, the small nods, the tears quickly wiped away. A woman in the front row closed her eyes and smiled like she understood exactly what I meant. I used to think I had to prove something, I continued, to show the people who didn't believe in me that I deserved a seat at their table. But it turns out you don't need their table when you can build your own. The crowd erupted in applause. I paused, letting it wash over me. Somewhere near the front, Eleanor Price sat in her usual composed posture, a rare softness in her expression. She caught my eye and smiled, small but real. In the back of the room, Lucas was standing with his camera, filming quietly. He didn't need to say anything. His smile said everything. As I wrapped up my talk, I glanced at the stage lights. They were blinding, yes, but warm too. For years I'd been afraid of being seen in the wrong way. Now I understood that light wasn't always judgment. Sometimes it was just truth. When the session ended, the audience rose to their feet. I bowed my head slightly, overwhelmed, and the applause followed me off stage. Outside, the ocean was waiting. I slipped off my heels and walked barefoot down the long stretch of Santa Monica Beach. The air tasted of salt and wind, and the horizon burned orange as the sun sank lower. Cooper trotted beside me, his leash loose, his paws, leaving uneven prints beside mine. The noise of the city faded behind us, replaced by the steady rhythm of waves and the cries of distant gulls. I stopped near the waterline, the sand cool beneath my feet. For a while, I just listened, to the waves, the wind, the world. Over the past year, I learned that justice doesn't come from making someone else regret their choices. It comes when you live fully quietly, in the peace they said you'd never find. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, the kind of blue that made you forget anything existed beyond it. I thought of all the versions of myself I'd been. The daughter trying too hard, the sister left out, the filmmaker waiting for permission. They wished I wasn't there. I whispered the words, almost carried away by the wind. I looked out at the horizon, at the sun, melting into gold. But here I am, Cooper barked softly, nudging my leg as if agreeing. I smiled and threw a small piece of driftwood into the shallows. He chased it, splashing into the surf. Behind us, the boardwalk lights flickered on one by one. I could hear distant laughter music from a street performer's guitar. The world moved forward. So did I. I picked up my shoes and kept walking, letting the waves lap at my ankles. Each step felt lighter, like something old had finally fallen away. They spent years trying to define where I didn't belong. But peace isn't found in proving them wrong. It's in finding where you finally fit without asking. The sun slipped lower, setting the sky on fire, pink fading to amber, then to deep blue. Cooper ran ahead, looking back every few seconds to make sure I was following. I stopped once more, watching the last light shimmer across the water, and felt a quiet certainty settle inside me. Sometimes life doesn't give you closure wrapped in apologies or explanations. Sometimes it just gives you enough distance to breathe, and that's enough. As the tide came in, I turned away from the ocean, smiling to myself. The evening wind carried my words out into the dark. Sometimes the best revenge, I said softly, is simply being exactly where you belong. The camera Lucas had left on the sand, still rolling from earlier, caught the last image, me and Cooper walking along the shoreline, our figures fading into the orange glow of the horizon. The sound of waves lingered as the screen faded to black. Then silence. Peaceful, steady earned,